All right, welcome everybody. We are getting set up to go live on Facebook. And then we'll get started with November's Tuesday Talks with Britin and Ann.
All right, looks like we're set.
Okay, well, I'm glad we are streaming because it's telling me that we're not. So if y'all will indulge me 1 second while I check on technical issues and make sure this is doing what it's supposed to.
It popped up on the Facebook.
All right.
See if it's still actually on the Facebook.
Who knows? Okay, it looks like we are live. So we will go with that information and I will share my screen and we'll get started. So thanks everybody so much for joining us for another Tuesday Talks with Britin and Ann. I'm Britin Bostic. I'm the Downtown and Historic Planner for the City of Georgetown. And joining me as always is Ann Evans, librarian at our award-winning Georgetown Public Library. We are pretty excited about our presentation for you today because we're talking about Georgetown before most of our documented history. And it is the longest span of history in Georgetown that we'll be covering today. It's a history that you may not be as familiar with. I learned a lot from Ann because she is the knower of things Georgetown and has amazing information and resources to share with us. So huge thanks to her for doing that. And we'll get wrapped up at the end with one of the oldest remaining structures in Georgetown and a little bit of a history disruption to it. Spoiler alert, the name of the house does not represent the actual original owner. And that's kind of a fun story that we've had supported from Liz Weaver with Preservation Georgetown. So November is Native American Heritage Month, and that's really important to share. But before we get started, we wanted to share a quick update. If you follow us on Facebook, if you follow the city's Facebook page, you hopefully will have seen this, but we talked about ghost stories in downtown last month. And we have another ghost story to share, an update on that, which is really wild. And this is a story and a sighting that Ann and I were both previously familiar with, but getting documentation is challenging, but we have it. And so this comes from our Parks and Recreation Department. Talk about award winners, they do amazing work. And what you might not know is that our Parks and Recreation Department maintains and the city owns historic cemeteries in Georgetown. So this is the Oddfellow Cemetery, the IOOF Cemetery at the end of East 7th Street on the east side of town. It's kind of tucked back behind Southwestern University. And the figure that you see in the photo, this is a photo from our Parks and Recreation Department. This is, they're a very legitimate source. And so you can see a white figure in the photo. It's a woman dressed in white that has had multiple sightings. And you said Southwestern students especially have reported seeing this woman a lot.
Yes, so because the cemetery is right behind Southwestern, there are a lot of students that take early morning jogs out there, that maybe do some other things there at night. We've had several people throughout the years say that they have spotted something similar throughout their time at Southwestern.
So we don't know who the woman is. I'm not aware of anybody kind of being told or communicated or getting a sense of who she is. We do have a lot of historic figures, very notable people buried in that cemetery. And that cemetery dates back to the late 1870s. I want to say 1878. But what's even wilder about this photo and what our Parks and Rec department shared with me is that there's more to it. So you can see the figure in white, but it's very difficult to see the other figures until they're circled. And so they saw not just the woman in white, but 4 other figures that were a lot more difficult to distinguish. in this same photo. So where you see the red circles are other ghostly figures that were much more transparent in nature. And so this has got everybody so freaked out that we even have one of our staff will not mow that cemetery anymore because they've had experiences that were really unsettling. We don't know that these are particularly harmful ghosts, but you can imagine not everybody would be comfortable with this experience. And then, Anne, you were telling me this isn't the only cemetery that our Parks and Rec staff have had interactions and experiences in. There's another one even.
There's the Citizens Memorial Cemetery, which is back kind of off of University on the other side, on the west side of town, tucked back kind of behind where Raising Cane's, Popeyes, that little contingent is now. We've had Parks Department staff say that they've smelt cigar smoke in particular areas of the cemetery as they're mowing. But overall seems to be a lot less creepy than the ones at IOOF. Put too many O's in there.
Lots of O's. So that's pretty wild. We just wanted to share that update. So if you missed that presentation, we did talk about ghost sightings and hauntings in the downtown. And you can see that posted at historic.georgetown.org. It also should be recorded on the city's Facebook page if you missed that last month. So if you have your own story, please let us know. We'd be glad to capture that and add it to our collection of ghost stories. We like to share these late fall every year around the Halloween season. Hope everybody had a fun and safe trick or treat yesterday. But we also have a continuing exhibit at the library. So just in case you haven't been able to see it and you're looking for a great excuse to get out of the house, learn more about some history. And y'all have the continuing Anne Frank exhibit through, it looks like, the middle of this month.
We do. We continue to have Let Me Be Myself, which is sponsored by Congregation Habar Shalom. And it will be here through November 15th. So please come see it. It is open for viewing any of the time that the library is open. You can do it like a self-guided tour. But if you would like a more docent-led tour, those are available on Saturdays and Sundays for walk-in. So please come see this wonderful exhibit that deals with things that we're still dealing with and the repercussions of the Holocaust, as well as acknowledging the differences that exist within our society.
That is really great. And so I'm really looking forward to the next set of exhibits at the library. They've been putting up fantastic artwork, as well as some really great informative exhibits. So check them out at library.georgetown.org for more information, or go visit. And remember, the Texas Reading Room is my favorite room in the library. Up on the second floor, you can access some great historic resources. So this is Native American Heritage Month. I am not a person with a known Native American heritage. I am pretty strictly descended from Western European peoples, which you can tell if you've ever seen me sunburn. But it is really important not only to acknowledge people with Native American heritage, but also the tribal peoples who were the original residents and inhabitants of North America, and including the Georgetown area. We have a very long history of tribal peoples here, and Anne has some fantastic information about who they were and what we know about them based on archaeological finds. So when we celebrate Native American Heritage Month, it's really a long span of history that we're celebrating. We're celebrating an incredible diversity of tribal peoples. They are not all the same tribe. They didn't all exist in the same type of area or geography with the same resources. And so you see a lot of differences across the geography of the US. You also have people who have had incredible service to our country, particularly in World War II, and you can see it highlighted here. You may be familiar with the Navajo code talkers, people who use their native language in order to communicate in World War II, which the Germans were never able to decipher, which is quite fantastic and a really novel and creative way to serve their country and kind of support our efforts during World War II. So you can find out all about that and so much more. And a great site is nativeamericanheritagemonth.gov if you want more information on that. Anne and I have become very familiar with tribal lands acknowledgements, and we started seeing these in national conferences a few years ago. And so there's some great information from the Smithsonian Institute on what a tribal lands acknowledgement is and how to go about that. So you can check that out through the Smithsonian Institute. But what this is, the very basics, and I'll explain it better, but the very basics are when you kind of begin a presentation or a ceremony in a place that you know had indigenous people. This is a place with indigenous lands. It's an acknowledgement that can be more elaborate or more simple. The example that they have from the Smithsonian is, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. And oftentimes that's a specific acknowledgement of the specific tribes that were known to inhabit that area. So, Anne, this is something that you're familiar with as well. And so when we do a tribal lands acknowledgement, what does that mean and what does that do? Kind of who are we recognizing? What's the importance of that recognition?
When we do this, we're occupying, or we are recognizing whose land we are occupying. We're acknowledging the history that is here, and hopefully promoting healing moving forward by acknowledging that history. And so in particular in Georgetown, we would like to acknowledge the Tonkawa, the Lipan Apache, the Comanche, the Humanos, and the Quetican. I say that. I'm so sorry for the mispronunciation. In particular, the Humanos are actually a group of at least 3 distinct tribes. And they were kind of grouped together by Spanish colonizers when they arrived. And that's kind of how they're described throughout written histories that we have.
So it's funny that in Central Texas and in South Texas as well, we have a lot of indigenous names that were kind of joined with Spanish language. So if you think about early Spanish settlement coming up, you go from Spain to what's now Mexico, and then you go from Mexico up into Texas. We had missions and we had other Spanish settlement. And so you end up in some cases with names like, the Spanish name juntos, together, is kind of incorporated into kind of banding tribes together and how the Spanish colonists looked at people, not necessarily how they viewed themselves. You're probably familiar with the Comanche people. You may know, if you've read a lot of Texas history books, oftentimes their land, kind of the area that they ranged in, was called the Comancheria. That's a Spanish name, not something that they called themselves and not a title for their own land. So as we have these layers of history, you get layers of language as well. And then Anne will share with us later in the presentation how important language is to our understanding of these people in these places. But Anne knows I love a map, so she got us a map, and this is an incredible map. You said, Anne, this is a crowdsourced map that's available online.
So this is from native-land.ca. It's a Native Land Digital project, which is a crowdsourcing project which seeks to recognize the lands occupied by different indigenous peoples, as well as treaties and languages. So you can, this is filtered currently by territories. And you can see on here that we have the Numunu, or the Comanche, the Lipan Apache, the Humanos, the Quetican, and the Tonkawa, who are all in this area. One of the reasons I wanted to show using this map is that when we look at maps of American Indians and which tribes were where, it's often done at a snapshot at one point in time. So like in the 1800s by the English colonizers who are arriving in the area. And it doesn't really document over time. So this map in particular is not simultaneous occupation. It's kind of the ebb and flow. These boundaries are not hard and fast either. So this map represents about 1,000 years or so of the different tribal peoples who occupied this land.
And so we have information on those peoples, and you may not have learned in history class in school that a lot of tribes have their own websites that you can visit to find out more information about them.
Yes, and so right now we just kind of want to list a few of these websites because those are the people best able to tell their history. Is if you go to these sites, many have museums or documented history that they've been collecting over the last few years. and actually writing down, which we can talk about a little bit more. And so who better to learn from than the tribes themselves. So this is the Humana Nation tribe. Again, this is kind of this conglomeration that was put together by the Spanish. So it's actually made up of different groups of peoples. And some of what is happening on this website is determining that ancestry. Is trying to suss it out. We also have the Quelticon, which are more south of here. They're very active in the San Antonio area, but they did kind of reach up here on the peripheries of Williamson County. And then, of course, Comanche or the Numunu, many people are familiar with. They have a wonderful museum if you're ever in Lawton, Oklahoma, to stop by. They've done a fantastic job of documenting their culture and their history and their language.
I'm generally pretty terrible at pronouncing words, including in English. And some of the names that I saw on the map, there is no way that I'm going to even know how to begin pronouncing those. So do they have pronunciation guides, or is there a way that you can find out how to correctly say some of these words and terms?
Yes, so many of these websites also have areas dedicated to the preservation of the language. So that's something we often don't talk about in history, is what it means when a language is lost. And particularly when language is lost from groups that rely on oral history traditions. And so it's incredibly important that this work is being done, and I urge you to support this work if you can. But the Comanche Nation in particular does have a linguistic department that they are focused on preserving the language. When the language is lost, so many stories are lost, but also so much nuance of the stories can be lost. So it's important to maintain it. So many of these tribes also do have a focus on maintaining language.
That's so cool.
The Lipan Apache actually does have two different tribes in Texas, or two different bands. So these are the two different websites for those bands. And then I wanted to focus a little more in particular on the Tonkawa. The Tonkawa's name for themselves is Tikanawatik, which means real people. The Tonkawa name actually comes from a Waco or Wichita, which they called them the Tonkawa, which means they all stay together. So that's kind of where that name was born out of. Is it's actually the Spanish interpretation of the way that the Wichita referred to them. They are a distinctive Tonkawan linguistic family that existed within South Central Texas up into Oklahoma and New Mexico. So they did have a distinct language, and they're working to preserve this as well. They were nomadic people, but they are one of the nomadic peoples that we know occupied this area through the 1500s through the 1800s. We have some of the first documentation, written history that comes out of this area is from the Spanish conducting excursions in here in the 1500s, and they encountered the Tonkawa as well as various other tribes throughout the region, but this is who is here. We also have documentation coming out of the 1740s when a contingent of Tonkawa went to San Antonio and asked for missions to be established. They were established here in 1747 along the San Gabriel River. They were the San Xavier Missions, which is where we get the name San Gabriel River from. There were three small outposts that were very short-lived. They only lasted about a decade before they were relocated. Why they were built here, what happened here when they existed, and why they were moved is a massive story in of itself. So I urge you to also go kind of investigate that if you want to. Maybe that'll be a future Tuesday talk, but those were up near Rockdale, and there is nothing left there of them now. So we know the Tonkawa continue to inhabit this area. There's encounters of them into really the 1830s or so, before the Lipan Apache and the Comanche kind of become predominant here. And we have more stories from English settlers and colonizers from the perspectives of dealing with Comanche. That's who most of the treaties are signed with in this area in the 1800s, because the Tonkawa had kind of been pushed down more South Texas. And by 1884, they're relocated to Fort Griffin. So I don't know about you, Britain, but when I was taught about the Trail of Tears, it's kind of this, it's taught as being this like one-time thing that happened. And it's mostly taught from the perspective of happening from the East Coast going out to Oklahoma.
Yes.
Yeah, that's not really the case. There's many different forced displacements that are happening throughout centuries, really, of the United States. And in particular in Texas, they're happening over the periods of decades. So the Tonkawa are moved, you can see here in 1859 to the Brazos Reservation, kind of in North Texas, and then they're moved to Fort Griffin out near Lubbock. And then they're relocated and forced to walk or ride in wagons the last 100 or so miles to Ponca Agency in 1884. And this is actually that final movement to that 1884 movement is what the Tonkawa consider to be their Trail of Tears. And they commemorate this each year by hosting their annual tribal powwow at the end of June. So June 29th is when this happened. And so they hosted that last weekend of June to kind of honor this, this sacrifice that they did. So, and if anyone has studied Comanche history, you know that it's also a little bit different. Quanah Parker and the kind of the last resistance that happened in the late 1880s before they were forced into Lawton. So it's not just this one-time event. It is happening over multiple generations at some points in time.
You know, it's kind of wild that we have in our deed records in Williamson County, we have references as late as 1916 to Indian Territory, which meant Oklahoma, but the association with displaced and removed Native American peoples to Oklahoma was kind of really strongly, it wasn't just that you had tribes in Oklahoma before European settlers, it's that a lot of people were displaced to reservations in Oklahoma. And then it kind of had this name Indian Territory to the extent that it's written into deed records when it's like, you know, referencing where people lived, or I'm buying this property from somebody who now resides in Indian Territory. It doesn't say the state of Oklahoma, and it doesn't list a town. And so the fact that that was happening just 100 years ago is kind of wild to me, given that we're seeing a lot of this displacement happening from 1855 through 1885 in particular on this map. So a lot of, when you go looking through history, you see a lot of things start to connect and start to kind of get a sense of how people were talking about things and what their different perspectives and experiences were with that.
Yes. The Tonkawa also are one of those groups that is working to preserve their tribal language, which I think is even more impressive considering they were down to just a few hundred in number over 100 years ago, to continue to try to preserve this. Anyone that has read The Land of Goodwater, which is written by Clara Scarborough, which is kind of, it's written in the 1970s, and it's really the only comprehensive history of Williamson County that we have. She actually got the name Land of Goodwater from what the Tonkawa call this area, which, again, I'm so sorry for the pronunciation, is Takashwe Puetswe, which means land of good water. And it was actually referring to the San Gabriel River and the quality of water that was here. So if you want to take a short Tonkawa language lesson, you can scan that QR code, or you can go to their website and check that out at tonkawatribe.com/language. But it's very interesting and very fascinating to hear the sounds that would have been spoken here not that long ago. So, but we're talking a lot about like the last 1,000 years or so. The history in this area goes back so much further. This is a timeline of American Indians from the Babblic Museum, and it's specific to Texas. You can see here some of that displacement happening. You can see the Comanche arriving in Texas in the 1740s, the Tonkawa encountering French colonists in the 1640s, or 1680s, sorry. And then even further back, we get the arrival of the Apache, Lyman Apache in Texas in the 1400, and then even further back, we're going into BCE, which means about 10,000 years ago, or 8,000 BCE, we have the Folsom people. And then about 11,000 years ago, or 9,500 BCE, we have the Clovis people. And about 16,000 years ago, we have the first evidence of people in Texas. So let's get into how that applies locally. This is Leanne. This is a facial reconstruction done of a woman who was found buried near Leander, hence the name. She was found at the Wilson Leonard site by TxDOT in the 80s when they were actually building what's currently Whitestone Boulevard. She is about 11,000 years old. And her burial was found near a small stream. And what's fascinating about her burial is she is one of the most intact human skeletons to ever be found in the United States, and one of the oldest, I should say, the oldest intact. She's not the oldest, but she's up there. She's in like the top 10, I think.
Incredible.
And the care with which she is buried is also something to note, because she was curled up into a fetal position. Her hands are actually placed underneath her head, kind of like a pillow, like she's sleeping. She was buried with a mano, which was used for chopping and grinding, much like manos and metates that are used today. We've used those for thousands of years in this area to process seeds and different things. And she was also found with a necklace or a shark's tooth at the base of her throat, basically. What's also fascinating about that is that indicates the level of trade and movement that's occurring even 11,000 years ago. For her to get a shark's tooth, she had to have traded or had to have been somewhere near the coast. And there's a lot of that you see, both in terms of tools that are passed around through North America, as well as shells and different things like shark's teeth necklaces. She was also covered up, her grave was covered with a limestone slab. So that meant someone was either marking her grave or potentially trying to protect her grave. So a lot of care was given to her. And it's amazing that she was there for 11,000 years undisturbed. But the people of this area goes back even further. So we said 16,000 years ago, we've gone back 16,000 years in Williamson County. This is the Galt site. This is up near Florence. It's kind of on the Williamson County, Bell County line. I will have to say most of the really fascinating discoveries technically take place in Bell County, but it's all our area, right? So this site has been known for a long time. It's a beautiful place. It's down kind of by a river. It slowly kind of steeps down into the river. So there's some flat land, but then you can also get up to higher land if there's like a flash flood that we're so prone to in this area, pretty quickly nearby. It's very well covered. It's nice temperature wise, and people are the same. People have always been the same, right? We like nice temperature. We like shade. We like easy access to food and easy access to water. And the Galt site has had all of those things for the last, give or take, 20,000 years. So you could very easily fish here. You could get turtle here. You could get deer here. All of that is still evident today. And all of that is evident in the archaeological records that they were consuming and using those things here. It kind of seems like this was probably a site where people hung out for a while. We know there's continuous inhabitation of this area for the past 15,000 years. There's evidence of that. We find a lot of people that are making blades. So it's probably a place, again, it's nice. It's probably a place you went, you camp out for a while, you refuel, you restock, you make some weaponry, you make some other tools for a trade, whatever. It's a place where you could very easily hang out. In about 1929 is some of the first organized excavations of this area. And this is when they find some evidence of Clovis culture in this area. So again, this is a distinct archaeological style of making tools that we've identified. It's named for Clovis, New Mexico. That comes from about 9,500 BCE. So about 11,000 years ago. Unfortunately, in the 1930s, this was a pay to dig site. And so for $2 a day, you could go out there and dig up as many artifacts as you would like and take them home. So a lot of the records of those peoples that we were talking about, the Lipan Apache, the Comanche, of the last 1,000 years or so, were kind of wrecked. So when they really began doing excavations in earnest in the 90s, they found that there was some irreparable damage over the past few thousand years. But when they went down to about the Paleo-Indian strata about 9,000 years ago, they started to get more complete records of the site. And so then excavation really began in earnest in 1999 through 2002, and 1.4 million artifacts were recovered. About half of those were Clovis age, so over 10,000 years old. And this is one of the largest discoveries of Clovis materials in the United States and in North America in general. Among those,
1.4, let back up. 1.4 million artifacts.
1.4 million.
And this is up near Florence.
This is up near Florence. Another thing that they found was a stone floor, which might indicate one of the earliest buildings, possibly the earliest building in North America. Here. And they found more than 100 engraved stones. So some of the earliest art in North America was found here, just up the road. When you can visit the Galt site, the Williamson Museum and the Bell County Museum both sell tickets to tours that happen out there once a month on Saturdays. You can also contact the Galt School of Archaeological Research if you want to arrange a tour for a larger group, a private tour. They're more than happy to do that. It's fantastic. I highly suggest trying to go in the fall or the spring when it's a little bit nicer out, not so much summer, although again, it's very nice and covered, and it's about 15 degrees cooler when you get down to the river. But when you go out there, a lot of people have been to the Galt site and they say, oh, I've seen the oldest art then. And it's this next slide, which is actually the petroglyph wall, which ties back to the Tonkawa. This is from the 18th century. So it's from the 1700s, and it is kind of a house shape with a cross on top. So here is some evidence of the Spanish missions right within Williamson County and within Bell County, and their impact on the local people. That someone found it important enough to draw this in a rock. This is not the artwork that they're talking about. The artwork they're talking about actually are incised stones, and these are at the Galt School, their laboratories that they're processing right now. And so these are very delicately carved stone pieces. Some are abstract, some, like the next slide you can see, might be kind of indicative of different plant life. And some are just beautiful etchings. that are very intricate and very, very obviously purposeful. So what exactly they mean, we'll probably never know, but we know that we have them and that these people existed, and it makes them more tangible, I think, at least to me personally, that they're there creating, just like we could be today. One other thing to note is a lot of these, not necessarily all of those stones, but a lot of these stones were made of Georgetown chert. Oh, before I go into what Georgetown chert is, most of the work at the Agalt site has kind of stopped. As of 2019, they had recovered an estimated 2.6 million artifacts. They had dug down to the bedrock. And they think that only accounts for about 3% of the artifacts they could potentially find at the site. So it's a world-renowned site that people from other countries, archaeologists in particular from other countries, know about and study, and it is just up the road from us. But a lot of the artifacts found there, as well as many artifacts you might be finding in your backyard, are made from the stones and the rocks that probably really annoy you in your backyard. And that's actually, a lot of that is limestone. It's Georgetown chert. And Georgetown chert is a specific type of limestone that is found only in really the Edwards Plateau area. So it's found in Williamson County, Bell County. There's a very similar one found in Hayes County. But this is actually sought after by flint knappers today. And if you went on eBay or even on Etsy, some people sell this and ship it worldwide, because flint knappers today still like the way it flakes. It can give you a very fine edge, a very sharp edge, unlike a lot of other things, without breaking. And this is actually an example from a leader's grave from early Caddo. So over in East Texas, and it's about 1,100 years old, and it's a knife, like a Hagen knife that's about 7 inches long, made from Georgetown chert, that made its way to East Texas and was important enough to be buried with its owner. So just another little interesting fact is that you will find Georgetown chert across the continent throughout history. So there's little pieces of Georgetown and little pieces of this area being traded throughout what we know as the United States now.
This is absolutely fascinating, because I'm one of those people who probably, has kind of come across a loose rock in my backyard, or like gotten really frustrated mowing, and, why is this kind of here? And so it's fascinating to know that this has been a valuable material. I love knowing that it's sold on eBay. That's really hilarious. I think, Ann, when we were putting this presentation together and talking through what we wanted to make sure people knew, this is something that I think it's really easy for me to think, oh, I'll just go pull a rock out of my backyard and I'll get busy chipping and I can make this artifact as well. But there's a lot of skill involved. And I think you were telling me that the artifacts that have been found of this material are way better in terms of quality and craftsmanship than some of the pieces that are produced today.
Yes, there are, if you compared a skilled flint knapper from a few thousand years ago to a skilled flint knapper today using the same material, we cannot even duplicate some of the best artifacts. So it really is this thing that takes so many years of practice and skill and things that we've lost throughout the centuries, and I'm sure in forms of knowledge being passed down on how to do it and how to do it well, that the next time you find something or see something, just take a moment to appreciate that skill.
This is fantastic. And 7 inches long, that's comparable to a modern kitchen knife, kind of the bigger size blades. So that's a fantastic knife. So it's really it's important to us to share history that is a little more difficult to find documentation of, let y'all know where the resources are. You can visit the Galt site, and so be sure to check out tickets for that. Again, that's with either the Williamson Museum, which is on our square in Georgetown, or you can contact the Bell County Museum to get more information about that. That sounds like a great way to spend a Saturday if you're interested in seeing some of the archaeological work that's been done here in Williamson County, kind of in our own outskirts of Georgetown. Georgetown is super specific as an area. And so if you kind of think back to pre-city times, the boundaries were a little more loose. Cities didn't exist. And so what we consider kind of in the area is very different. You know, now we might assign that to Florence, or we might assign Whitestone Boulevard to Cedar Park very specifically, but there may not have been that clear distinction, you know, several hundred or even these thousands of years ago. So this is really fascinating, and I've learned a lot because I tend to focus on what I can see in photographs and what I can see in maps really over the last 170 years. And so knowing what happened before 170 years ago is so much fun. And we thought a good way to begin celebrating Native American Heritage Month and share information that y'all may not have seen before. But we do have an early settlement in Georgetown that I do get questions about. And so we wanted to be able to share the story of the coffee house, not only because it's one of the oldest remaining structures in Georgetown, but because we have information that says the history that we thought we knew is not quite accurate. So anytime we can share an updated history or more accurate information, we love to do that. And I owe a big thanks to Liz Weaver with Preservation Georgetown. She's their historian, and she began uncovering some information that she shared in a talk she gave for Preservation Georgetown at Grace Heritage Church a couple of Saturdays ago. Preservation Georgetown is doing some educational programs Saturday mornings at Grace Heritage Church, so please check them out. This was a fantastic talk. So Liz Weaver designed and sewed this beautiful quilt based on cattle brands for Williamson County cattle owners. And in the research that she did to create that quilt, she found a number of really interesting stories. One of those, which kind of dovetailed with some findings that I had been doing related to my work as the city's historic planner, was that this coffee house, as we've known it, may not have originated with coffee. It may actually be the Vontress house. And so if you go back to some of the original settlers of Georgetown, Georgetown was founded in 1849. So be thinking about 1848, or about 170 years ago, we've got people who are beginning to settle this part of the country. So this is a time well before, or a few decades before, a lot of the tribes were removed and relocated either to other parts of Texas or to Oklahoma, or before the Comanche people were kind of increasingly pushed out of central Texas because of European settlement. So there was a lot of conflict between these tribes and their lifestyles and how they managed rangeland, how they managed game, and people wanting to farm and bring in railroads and industry and all the things that came after that. So think around 170 years ago, and the earliest deed that I have for a man named Edward Vontress that I found in the county records is from 1852. And a man named Edward Vontress, who ended up being a county judge who was really well connected in political circles in early Texas. He and a man named Thomas Hughes, I've talked about him before. We've featured him, but more specifically his daughter, because she tore his house down in the 1920s and subdivided for a gas station and apartment complex. So let us know if you want more information on that. That's kind of a wild story. But anyway, Judge Hughes and Judge Vontress got together and started buying property in 1852. But I suspect that Edward Vontress was here before 1852. Williamson County came out of Milam County, and so he may have actually bought property in Milam County before we became Williamson County. And then there's some records after that, but it's a little unclear how he got the homestead that we believe him to have had. But like I said, Liz Weaver had some really great information on this, and I think they may have posted a recording of her talk online. So check out Preservation Georgetown for more of that. But the first time that we can see what we know it is the coffee house, it was called the JT Coffee House, named for Colonel John Truesdale Coffee. He came to Georgetown after the Civil War. He came to Georgetown around 1865. And the house that has his name on it is shown here on the far left edge where the arrow is pointing. And so you can see the Southwestern University campus. This photo is from around 1934, we think late 1934-ish. So you can see Southwestern, you can see a great part of our Old Town Historic District just south of that, but there wasn't a lot south of 15th Street at that point in time. You can see that was agricultural land, and the coffee homestead was originally much larger. By the time we get to this photo in 1934, it was in second, possibly third generation ownership, and it had been, some of it had been sold off and developed with newer homes. It's a constant frustration to me that my photos of buildings are either blocked by trees or I get the backs of buildings as the best photo, but that's just what you get to deal with sometimes when you're looking through historic records. So this is a fantastic photo taken from that airplane. You can see a bunch of dust was kicked up over by the Southwestern University football field. That football field's no longer there. So if you're a little bit confused, that's the main building that looks like the castle. That's still there. And there's now a street right next to it where Maple Street got extended, but they used to be the football field. Anyway, you can see the back of the coffee homestead. It's set at kind of a funny angle, and it ended up being on the end of its own street, which is now James Street, but it's set off into an angle a little bit weirdly. That's because this property predated everything that you see around it. All of that was built from about the 1880s onward. And so this was basically facing downtown or facing the courthouse square. And it may have been built as early as the 1850s, if not earlier. So that's where it gets challenging to know exactly how old it is. But the history of this property and what we know of it really starts with a man named Elisha Roberts. And he was one of the original Texans. You know, there are a few hundred of them, but really not that many. But his obituary, and we're using Find a Grave, which is maybe a little bit sketchy in terms of accuracy, but it's a really good go by to get you started. His obituary is really fantastic, and it starts with veteran of the War of 1812. That's a pretty bold statement and kind of really sets the tone for this family. Elisha Roberts, it says, was a Texas pioneer and public official born in 1774. Think about it, the Revolutionary War was in 1776. So he was born 2 years before that in Hawkins County, Tennessee. So that's really kind of the backwoods of the US at that point in time. He was married by 1800 in Kentucky to a woman named Martha Gill, and they're known to have had 9 children. In 1811, they moved from Kentucky to Louisiana. And then during the War of 1812, Roberts served as a lieutenant and quartermaster under General Isaac Roberts' brigade of West Tennessee Militia and Lieutenant and Captain Bickham's company, the Louisiana Militia. In 1822, Roberts entered East Texas in pursuit of a runaway slave whose wife had been carried to Texas by another master. So this gets into before Texas was a state, before Texas was its own country, and when Texas was ruled by the Spaniards and slavery was not something that was always kind of legal in Texas. And so this is a point in time in which you have a lot of people trying to move enslaved persons with them. And sometimes that worked out, sometimes that didn't, or sometimes people would try to escape to Mexico if they were enslaved. And so this is a time, though, even before we really get that very clear period of settlement from kind of Western European or Anglo people, and it started to cause a lot of conflict with the Spanish. So this is a time that there were not a lot of cities in Texas beyond some of those key cities like San Antonio. Anyway, all that to say, he ended up settling his family near the site of present San Augustine in 1824, and then began doing a lot of work. He did enslave African persons in order to do a lot of that work, and he built the first cotton gin at San Augustine, which is one of the things he's really known for. He ended up serving a lot of political offices, and when Texas kind of went through its revolution, he was kind of a high official for what that's worth in the Wild West. But he died in 1844, and then his wife died in 1845. And so they have a centennial marker And it's noted especially for him establishing that cotton gin at St. Augustine. What can be helpful with Find a Grave is it can provide family connections. Sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it does provide family connections. So if you skip to his granddaughter, she's a woman that we're very interested in. One, because I'm super interested in women with 6 names, and 2, because she's really the key to all of this. So let's skip over to a man named Edward Hughes Vontress, and he's the one who you saw that 1852 deed for. He's the one that I think was in Williamson County really early on. And so what's wild about him, he married Eunice Margaret Amelia Allen Coffey. She became Coffey in 1858. So they get married in 1858. He's still a pretty young man. He was born in 1825 in Kentucky. He went to fight in the Civil War. They had 3 kids. Kind of right after their 3rd child was born, he went to fight in the Civil War, and he ended up being killed by a bolt of lightning in Louisiana. And he was buried in Louisiana on his brother's plantation. He didn't make it back to Texas. So at the end of the Civil War, John Truesdale Coffey comes to Texas. He's already married twice. He's had, I think, 8 kids with those 2 wives by this time. They had both allegedly passed away. And so he comes to Texas and he marries Eunice, who is the widow of Edward Vontress. I think this house that we're talking about was actually the Vontress property that she was owning and occupying as a widow. And then he kind of married her and took on her property and ended up getting his name attached to the property rather than hers. So she was Eunice Margaret Amelia Allen Vontress Coffey, granddaughter of early Texas alcalde Elisha Roberts. She married Captain Edward Hughes Vontress in Williamson County, Texas. He died in 1864 in that accident with the lightning in Louisiana. And then their children, 2 of their children passed away early on in their lives. And then she married the widower, Colonel John Truesdale Coffey, in 1865 after he got here. And then they had an additional, the reports vary. I've heard they had as many as 6 children. Here it says 5, but they could have had 6 children and maybe 1 didn't survive. So her obituary is pretty extensive also. She was known to be an early settler. She was recognized for being in Williamson County very early on. It talks a bit about her first husband being a judge. And then we get down to all of the children that survived her. And this is a statement that I think is really fantastic. Thus, another pioneer who braved the storms and vicissitudes of early days has gone to her reward. She was a member of the Methodist Church and lived a consistent Christian life, loyal to her church, her family, and her neighbors. Her life was one of usefulness and worthy of emulation. To the bereaved, the Tribune extends condolence. So this was published in the Bartlett Tribune and News in 1919. And so after she passed away, she and Coffey's, I believe it was their youngest son, ultimately inherited the homestead property, the one that we've seen in the photo. And they are the ones, her youngest son is the one who I think established the University Park subdivision, which became a very popular neighborhood developed after World War II in Georgetown. So here you can see the Find a Grave record for Colonel Coffey and a picture of him, a listing of some of his children. He came from Tennessee. A lot of people came from Tennessee, Kentucky, also Missouri. He apparently moved from Tennessee to Missouri, was the state senator there, and then a candidate for Missouri Secretary of State before he went into the Civil War and then moved to Texas. So that is a lot of biographic information, but the way these families connected and the way there were so few people in Texas is kind of fascinating. So if you are as excited and interested as I am in the myth of Sam Houston slept here, we have a lot of properties in Georgetown that I've heard people say Sam Houston slept here in this house. And sometimes I can quickly know that that probably wasn't the case because the house was built after Sam Houston passed. And so that doesn't connect very well, but this house did exist, we believe, at the time of Sam Houston's life. And because of the connections to the Vontresses and because of the connection to Colonel Coffey, we think it was very likely that he knew them, although I really think it was the Vontresses that Sam Houston probably knew. And Eunice Vontress probably, when she married John Coffey, probably provided him with her social connections and the people that she knew in early Texas, especially because her first husband had been a judge and was really, really well connected. And I believe served in the Texas legislature at one point early on. So in 1984, we did a historic resource survey of Georgetown. That was our first one, and this house was captured on that survey. And it says the Texas State Board of Review did not approve the architectural significance of the J.T. Coffey House because of alterations to the structure. The rear part of the house is one of the few extant or remaining farmhouses remaining from the 1860s in Georgetown. This original one-story frame dwelling was built on the two-cell plan around 1863. And remember, 1863 is before Coffey is in Georgetown. He wasn't here till 1865. So that's why we think this is likely the Vontress house. And there are other reasons why we think this house might be just a little bit older. So it's associated with Coffey, but here it is in 1964. So you can see all of the houses that developed around it. These are ranch style houses mostly, or minimal traditional houses popular after World War II. And so you can see the water tower that has the Southwestern name had already been constructed at that point, and this house sits right under the water tower. A lot of the outbuildings had been removed by this point because they had sold off kind of some of that remaining homestead property, leaving a much smaller lot for the house. And so what's fascinating about this is we had photos of it in 1984 as well. And the house that you see here doesn't really read as an 1860s or even an 1850s house. The reason is this is a part that was constructed much later, probably late in the 19th century. What we're looking at is the piece behind, which is pretty hard to see. So this is what we could see of the house in 1984. But this piece to the rear is that original section of the house. And it had a fireplace because you had to have a fireplace for cooking and heating purposes. And you can see that new part was connected via kind of a breezeway or a covered area. That original they call it a farmhouse. I think that's pretty generous. It's kind of a cabin that was built before we had railroads, and when all of your building materials either had to be locally kind of hewn, you had to cut the wood, you had to cut the stone yourself, or you had to have ox-drawn wagons haul it up from like Houston or San Antonio or something like that. It was really difficult to get those nicer materials that you can see in the portion of the house on the left, the newer portion where you can see those big panes of glass and those really thin wood sections in between that show a refined detail that was really much more available after railroads came to town in the 1870s. So here's some additional photos of some of the outbuildings that remained at the time. I don't think they're there anymore. And then also this hand-cut limestone chimney. If you got really close, you'd be able to see some tool marks that I'm pretty familiar with on limestone cut in the 1800s. So here are some additional, you've got a fence that some vines have grown into, some trees have grown into. I can see some hackberries there, pretty typical. You did have chimneys on either side of both sections of the house because this is well before electricity and you needed those fireplaces for cooking, for heat, and for light. The photo on the right shows a deteriorated porch, and I will say, if you have wood on your house, whether it's historic or not, please paint or seal it to make sure that this kind of deterioration doesn't happen. It's one of the best things that you can do for maintenance and preserving the longevity of your wood, either siding or trim or details or porches, etc. And then there's a great photo of the side of the house. Probably did have some changes over time. That's why it appears that the Texas Historical Commission essentially at the time said, well, this house has had too many changes. I might not quite agree with that given the history of it and that it is one of the oldest remaining structures that we have. And then we have this funny piece of door that acted as a gate. It was necessary to reuse parts and pieces over time because you didn't have an easy way to get materials and supplies sometimes. So they use this door as a gate, and then that no trespassing sign is a great reminder that these are private properties, and just because they're awesome and historic doesn't mean that you have a right to trespass on them. So if you are going to visit a historic site, please do make sure you get owner consent in agreement before you go investigating those. And here's a more recent photo showing that big water tower and really dwarfing this structure. It did get a new front porch right after 1984 that kind of spans the front instead of that front stoop that you saw originally. So that concludes our presentation for today. Thank you all so much for joining us. We really had a blast putting this together and sharing this information. If you do have any questions or follow up, and people do follow up with us with more information that they provide to us or questions, we love that. You can email historic@georgetown.org, or you can call me 512-930-3581, or you can call Ann at 512-930-6614. So we will have a Tuesday Talks for December. We're really looking forward to that. And then we will take a break in January because normally that's right after the holidays and everybody's either on vacation or getting back. So we'll have one more presentation for the year next month. So stay tuned for that. If you have any questions, please let us know. And otherwise, Ann, do you have any closing remarks for our presentation today?
No, thank you so much.
This was great fun. So y'all join us next month and we'll see everybody later.